everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that we're excited to officially welcome Nicole Shanahan and her show Back to the People to the Blaze family. Nicole's a Silicon Valley attorney, entrepreneur, and advocate who spent years fighting for transparency, freedom, and real change. She's been a major voice in the Maha movement and worked along RFK Jr. to push for a government that actually works for the people, not just the elites. On her brand new show on Blaze TV, Back to the People, Nicole is going to dig into the conversations that mainstream media ignores. She brings together experts, activists, and everyday people to tackle tough issues and share untold stories while finding real solutions rooted in truth and humanity. You can grab a sneak peek of what Nicole is doing on her Blaze TV show if you head over to YouTube and enter Nicole Shanahan. That's youtube.com, Nicole-Shanahan, or you can just type her name in the search bar. We want to welcome Nicole and excited for her new show. All right, guys. So I have been delving into Heidegger. Heidegger is a very complex philosopher, one that I found particularly challenging, but it definitely opens a lot of interesting things. I had definitely read a lot of Dugin previously, and Heidegger underlies a lot of what he talks about. So it's great to have that context now and better understand these things. And I thought it would be good to do an introduction to the idea of phenomenology, because it is a different way of looking at philosophy. I think a way that many people are not familiar with. And I think it would be good if we had a general understanding of the movement and how it led up to people like Heidegger and what it's done to modern philosophy. So joining me today is Michael Millerman. He teaches philosophy, has a great school of his own, has written many books on both Heidegger and Dugin. Thank you for joining me, man.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I guess we'll just start at the beginning. What is phenomenology? Where did it start? And how is it different from the philosophy that most people are probably familiar with?
Well, phenomenology is a method of doing philosophy, you could say. And it differs from regular. So if people think about philosophy, they may think about concepts, arguments, logical relations between concepts and arguments, answers to questions like why be moral or what is justice? Is there a God? Those kinds of questions. Phenomenology is a little bit different in the sense that the aim is to describe things as they are clearly. And behind that aim, there's the recognition that for the most part, we don't do that. We put something in between ourselves and the world that we're perceiving or the world that we're experiencing. We put in our assumptions, our opinions, our judgments, and most damningly in some sense, our theories. And so the intuition or the hunch of the phenomenologists is that we don't see things clearly because we have too many things in the way, and we also move too quickly. And therefore, the task of phenomenology is to remove things that are impediments to our clear vision and to slow down and describe the world as it is for us or the world as it occurs to us. And that's why at times the descriptions can seem so simple as almost to be self-evident. But in a way, the whole point is that things that should be self-evident to us are buried under so many obstacles that we just need to work on restoring that first contact in a way, that naked apprehension.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people first looking at this, and I certainly have some amount of that reaction myself, you look at this and you say, oh, well, this is just overcomplicating the obvious, right? These are things that I should know already, or we already know this. Why are we going back and looking at this? This is already so clear. This is like basic 101 stuff. Why am I always going back and breaking this down and adding layers of complexity to something that should be basic and obvious and simple? But the more you look at it, the more you look at the way that they are analyzing these instances, I think it does make sense. But it takes a little bit of time to get your brain to start moving in that direction or to stop leaning on all those assumptions that you had already had. And I want to get deeper into obviously where this got started. But before we do, let's hear from today's sponsor. This episode of the Auron MacIntyre Show is proudly sponsored by Consumers Research. You've heard about Larry Fink and BlackRock and ESG and all the ways that they're ruining your life, making your groceries more expensive and making your video games more woke. Well, Consumers Research has spent the last 5 years making Larry's life hell, and they're just getting started. Their work and its consequences have been profiled by the Washington Post, New York Times, and most recently, Fox News business reporter Charlie Gasparono wrote a whole chapter in his book, Go Woke, Go Broke, on how effective they've been at dismantling BlackRock's ESG patronage scheme. He's making Larry Fink lose the last bit of hair on his balding head, and you should follow Will's work on X so you can laugh along with him. His handle is at Will Hild, at Will, WILLHILD, on X. All right. So, like you said, this is a very different way to look at philosophy, and it takes probably a decent amount of hubris to say, well, everybody else has gotten this wrong, and I need to start stripping all these assumptions away because, all of philosophy before this is an impediment to this kind of understanding. So who decides to take this step for the first time? When do we start to see phenomenology come on the scene?
So there's a history of the thinkers who went through this process, but I would say that the easiest way to think about it is starting with Descartes. And it's interesting because you said, who are we to cast aside how philosophy has been done or what we've thought? And Descartes is known for his radical doubt of all received wisdom, and even the radical doubt of what we take to be obvious and trivial, namely that we exist, that there's a world out there. So Descartes, by radically doubting to the very roots of all questions, he discovered this realm of the consciousness. Everybody roughly knows, even if they haven't followed Descartes' actual steps for themselves, which, by the way, I want to say here parenthetically that it is important in phenomenology to reproduce the steps so that if people can do it for themselves and see it for themselves, that's going to be the best way to see what the method yields. Same with Descartes. So he asks us to radically doubt even the existence of external objects, of ourselves, and all the way up to basic mathematical truths. In doing so, he discovers this fundamental fact that in order for there to be doubt, there must, I am the one who doubts. So, the I exist because there's no doubt, there has to be the somebody doubting and so on. So when Descartes puts everything under the question and discovers this realm of consciousness, he goes back to now offer arguments for the existence of God and so on. But some of his readers, like Edmund Husserl, who's extremely important for Heidegger and who in some sense is the most important root here of phenomenology, he stopped and said, wait a minute, Descartes, you've discovered this realm of consciousness where we can actually stay a little bit longer before bouncing back out to our proofs of the external world and objective world and of God. So Husserl takes the results of Descartes' inquiry and says, let's stay for a minute in that state of doubt where we have uncovered the consciousness, but we haven't yet, as it were, reconstructed the external world. Okay, so the connection between Descartes and Husserl is very important. Then the simple, if you had the three greats to my mind that line up here, it would be Descartes to Husserl, Husserl to Heidegger. But if we stop for a minute with Husserl, he suddenly says something like the following. So just imagine, whoever's listening to this, wherever you are, and myself and yourself, we put aside the question of the quote unquote objective existence of the external world. We're still left with our experience of something. I mean, I still see you, my computer, pen, coffee cups, right? I mean, there's still a world of appearance that's there for me, even if I don't have a judgment about its actual existence. And for Husserl, that's the way the world is for us in our consciousness, independently of the questions of its existence. And we can now sort of map out that terrain. So what's happening in my acts of consciousness when I look over there or look over here? Again, it sounds very basic, but the idea is that these basic structures, in some sense, like I said, we take them for granted so often that we've never really identified their structures. And so Husserl made it his aim to identify these structures. So for instance, when you hear a piece of music, at any given time, all you're hearing in the piece of music is that, the specific note, let's say, that's playing. And yet, phenomenologically, you also have the experience, the memory of the previous notes and the anticipation of the coming notes. So everybody listens to music, but not everybody has tried to describe the structure of the experience of time perception in listening to music. So that's sort of the level. And I just want to add one important detail here. So how we get from Descartes to Husserl, again, Descartes discovers this realm of consciousness by doubting everything and discovering that something remains despite the doubt. Husserl examines that whole realm of consciousness, tries to map it out and sort of exhaust the description of its structures. But then Heidegger does something amazing. Heidegger says, the phenomenologists have put us on incredible ground here by describing things that we take for granted and helping us to see what we are. But there's something that they are taking for granted, which is putting a limit on what they can actually bring to light. They are taking for granted that the basic human experience or the basic category or the basic realm or domain is consciousness. And that's accurate. I mean, that they do sort of do that. They treat consciousness as the fundamental ground, and the world that we have in our consciousness is the one that they examine. And Heidegger, quote unquote, radicalizes phenomenology, that's his presentation of it, by saying that no, consciousness itself is something that we're presupposing and taking for granted. Like, in other words, the phenomenologists, they assume less than the other people did, but they still assume too much by assuming consciousness. So Heidegger pushes us into being and existence, and suddenly a whole world opens up for him that is even broader than just what's happening to and with and for consciousness. So yeah, Descartes discovers the territory, Husserl maps it out in more detail, Heidegger radicalizes it, breaks through the barriers of consciousness as the basic domain and brings us into existence, human existence, and therefore not just perception, but emotion, attitude, comportment, and all of these other human experiences.
Yeah, I feel like the one trick that the phenomenologists keep playing is that the new one says, no, you took a little too much for granted. And the next one says, no, you took a little too much for granted. That's always the discoveries. There's one more thing that you took for granted that I'm not going to, and I'm gonna analyze there. Yeah.
That's true. There is a sort of like one-upsmanship, and I discovered something that you presupposed, and that makes me superior to you. So that's a possible pitfall. And I think maybe every philosophical method has these pitfalls. Again, they culminate in comic situations. Like you can say, you can spin out a whole comedy about who presupposed more and who presupposed less. But I do think that Heidegger's insights about the limitation of taking consciousness as the ground is a genuine breakthrough. Heidegger obviously himself omitted many things from his primary area of interest. So in a sense, it's very important as we read these thinkers and as we think about them, the two pitfalls are like we reject it too soon or we accept it too completely. That's always the case. So Heidegger, as his intelligent readers noted, he doesn't write very much about morality, as though morality is not a part of human life, whereas it is a part of human life and it needs to be understood. He was monomaniacally focused on getting away from consciousness as the ground and going to being as the ground. And in his obsession, he made incredible discoveries that have touched every field and every thinker, even though he left some things out of sight. So that's just what we have to work with. Although you're right that there's that sort of comic one-upsmanship too.
So we've got Descartes, as you point out, who's got this separation of experience, the object and the subject. You could say probably someone like Kant, obviously making a pretty important contribution there as well. Though obviously, then when you get to someone like Husserl, that's a very big shift. So what shift is occurring? Obviously, you said we're moving from consciousness to being, but what other shifts are occurring as you move away? Because obviously, Heidegger has a lot to say about Descartes. He goes in quite a bit of detail, critiquing, talk about what he got right and wrong. So what are the big shifts there between those two schools?
Yes, and about Heidegger says a lot about Kant as well. I mean,
right.
For Heidegger, a lot of these thinkers, he puts them into periodizations or into categories and buckets. I mean, the whole of Western philosophy is like the biggest category that has been a mistake from Plato until Nietzsche. Within that, there are certain phases, and for sure, Descartes is a phase, and Kant is a phase. In some sense, Kant culminates the phase that Descartes started because he's still too. He still can't. They meet a limit point. So, without getting overly theoretical about it, let's just walk it back again for a minute to their basic hunches, intuitions, and aims. For Kant, we don't have to answer the question about what is the external world actually. We don't have access to it. So here he shares the view that all that we have access to is the way the world occurs to us or the way the world appears to us, in brackets, in consciousness, or for transcendental subjectivity, to use some of the jargon from Husserl and Kant. But it's important to understand, I think it's important to understand as people think about this, that in order to get this as the phenomenologists do, you can't treat them as theories. You have to link it to yourself. So again, there's okay, let's start from the basic thing. You see a world around you. That's indisputable for everybody, right? As I said, catalog the things around you. Okay. then you can ask all kinds of questions about it. So take a very basic one that interested Kant. If I have cause and effect relationship, okay? I set this thing on fire, it burns. I lift this thing up and let go of my hand, it falls. So the notion of a cause and effect relationship seems like something that is a rational relation and discovery that applies not just because I happen to have derived it from my experience of the world empirically. Like tomorrow, maybe cause and effect will break down. Just like tomorrow, maybe the sun won't rise. Kant said, no, wait a minute, that can't be right. Empiricists like David Hume had argued that cause and effect, we don't actually know that it's not a law. It's just something that you've perceived it X amount of times. Like you and I woke up today. Hopefully we'll wake up tomorrow. One day we won't wake up. Sorry to say, so cause and effect works today, it works tomorrow, but maybe one day it'll stop working. Kant said, no, that can't be right because that seems to deprive the world of rational relations. And it doesn't seem right because if you think through your experience of the world, not just cause and effect, but unity, difference, existence, change, sameness, number, these basic rational categories seem to be something that don't come to us from the world, but that, as it were, we impose on or bring to the world. So these philosophers, they think through this puzzle that there's a relationship, not just between, like I said, we can sort of bandy it about more or less trivially, or people can treat it more or less trivially, subjectivity, objectivity, but it's like all of the categories of thought or rational categories that we bring to bear on our experience of the world. And again, if we derive those from the world, that would be very strange. But then how do we impose them on the world? That's also kind of weird. And so, for instance, I feel myself sitting in this chair. I see myself sitting in this chair. I know that I'm in a chair and in a room. So I'm like one of the things in this room. But at the same time, my reason is not in this room. It imposes the categories of existence onto this room. So that idea that we have one foot in the world and one foot, as it were, making the world, constituting and configuring the world, giving the world its law, the laws of reason and rational categories, that split between the empirical self and the transcendental self is a huge problem for philosophy, for philosophers, for Heidegger, and for Kant. Kant had certain points that he reached where he talked about, I could tell you the jargon, transcendental unity of a perception. But basically, it's again, this point where somehow these two worlds meet, but without really being able to say how. It's a mystery. It is a profound mystery that we have one foot in and one foot out of the world. And Heidegger tried to deal with that mystery. Husserl tried to deal with that mystery. And it duplicates or divides the self into the empirical self and the transcendental self. And one of the things that Husserl did, he has a work called Crisis of the European Sciences, where he says, look, we scientific moderns have a model of the world that is primarily mathematical, it's algebraic, geometric. We have like a mathematical world projection. You can cast a mathematical net over the whole world. And suddenly you can deal with it because it's measurable, it's predictable, what's happening a billion miles away and so on. But he said, what is it in the human experience that allows us to produce a mathematical model of the world? That's another one of those things that you cannot just take for granted. So Husserl tried to sort of spell that out. He's like, we're left with this problem that the modern man, in order to have a solid foundation, self-understanding and foundation of the world, has erected a theoretical construct, which is solid so far as it goes, but it rests on this invisible, mysterious, and puzzling foundation. How does human subjectivity produce a model of scientific universality and rationality? So that gave way to a crisis. That's why Husserl's book's called Crisis of the European Sciences. That's why Heidegger, in Being and Time, at the start, the first, 10, 20 pages, he says the sciences are in a crisis. The foundations of the sciences are in a crisis. Everywhere is in a crisis. And this crisis forces us to go back to the basics. And again, the crisis is that we seem to have a solid foundation, but on the other hand, it rests on nothing. And we can't give an account of how the nothing gave rise. It's kind of like, how did God create the world from nothing? How does scientific modernity create a universal model from the mystery of human subjectivity. You're left with a puzzle. So people who think that religion is less rational than science, the puzzle of creation of the making of the world exists in both cases. Just in one case, God is the maker. In the other case, man is the maker. But the mystery of the making of the world remains. So these are the sorts of puzzles that pushed Heidegger and Husserl into like, okay, wait, right? We can't, and Kant in a way, because Kant also had to say, we can't answer questions about the quote unquote real world because we don't have access to it. We have to limit our inquiry to what we actually have access to. So then the question is where they place the limit, why they place it there, and whether they ultimately overcome these mysterious puzzles.
All right, well, we're going to dive deeper into the phenomenology itself, but before we do, let's hear about Blaze TV. Hey guys, if you've been watching this show for a while, then you know that around here we encourage something that conservatives usually don't do, winning. That's why it was so great to see Donald Trump's electoral victory along with the cultural and political momentum that the right just hasn't had in a very long time. But we also know that the fight is far from over, and at some point the left will start pushing for censorship again. If you like what I'm doing here and you want to keep it going, then head over to Blaze TV. They have the behind-the-scenes content, exclusives, and documentaries that you're just not going to see anywhere else. And it starts at just $8 a month, basically the price of a fancy coffee, when you use the promo code Auron at checkout. That's only 26 cents a day to stand with a platform that stands with you. So go to blazetv.com/Auron and subscribe today. That's blazetv.com/Auron. The promo code is AURON, and you'll save $20 right now off the annual plan. So as you pointed out, we have Husserl, who is kind of probably the pivotal figure, probably the first person to be using this method in the way that we would recognize it now. But then you have Heidegger, who was his student and is writing in large amount in response to what Husserl had been doing. What significant changes, what would be the differences between the phenomenology of Husserl and the phenomenology of Heidegger?
So again, to my view, in radicalizing, as he puts it, Husserl's emphasis. So let's take, what would a Husserl approach to phenomenology, simply stated, okay, because Husserl wrote thousands and thousands and thousands of pages, right? It's dense, difficult work as you get into this, but very simply stated, again, like the example of the music, right? Analyzing the structure of what's retained and what's anticipated in a perceptual act. And even just recognize, so even, for example, again, if people try to replicate this, it would be best, but I guess it's hard to do on the spot. So like, what are the acts of consciousness? So for example, I can attend to something. I can give something my attention, right? So Husserl actually thought it was important to catalog the acts of consciousness. So I can attend to something directly. Maybe I can be roughly aware of something happening. That's another way of comporting my consciousness, right? There can be a rough awareness of something. There can be a direct awareness of something. One of the breakthrough discoveries, this, again, I believe that it may sound weird to people. It sounded weird to me too at first because it seems so trivial, but it ended up being quite interesting, is that all acts of consciousness are directed, which means that, and he calls that intentionality. So for example, if I'm listening, my act of listening has the structure of listening to, or listening for, or listening despite. There's a structure to these acts of consciousness. And in fact, one of the strange things when people read, I think Heidegger, for example, or Dugin's Heideggerianism or Husserl, is you'll see in their writing, it'll say, you'll see a formulation like listening for ... or listening to ... And normally we take ... to mean, I'm passing over something, I'm skipping over something. But here it's because they're like, we can't fill in the blanks because we're just discussing the structure of the act itself. So attending to something, listening for something, listening to something, and so on. Ignoring something. So he catalogs the acts of consciousness in that sense. Again, tries to understand the relationship of one to another, and so on. Setting aside Heidegger for a minute, I want to say something else here about Heidegger. There are two important operations in Husserl's world, which is that number one, the doubting the existence of the external world. Like that's a necessary step. In order to get into the world of phenomenology, in some sense, you have to go through that trial by fire of actually for yourself doubting the existence of the external world. So I'll give you an example. If I talk to my wife, or if you talk to your neighbor, you talk to anybody who doesn't really care about philosophy or do philosophy, they do not have the natural view of the world that the world is there for them in consciousness or for consciousness. It's like, no, here's my camera, here's my phone, here's my paper. It's just the natural attitude to the world is objects, stuff. When you radically doubt the existence of the external world, you sort of bring everything into the ambit or circle of consciousness. You're now treating it as for you, for the mind, as an appearance, and so on. So that is called, that's one of the operations that Husserl does. But then there's another operation. Okay, so again, one is bringing the world from objective existence to phenomenal existence. But then there's somehow an even more interesting thing, which is you go from describing the objects and your perception of objects, or things in your perception of things, to now describing your, like, the circle turns back on it, the arrow turns back on itself. So let's say normally my attitude is outward, okay? My arrow of intentionality, my sort of directionality of action and attention is outward. Then you put your attention on the relationship between attention and things. And then somehow gradually, to use a phrase that I first heard from Dugan, maybe he stole it from somewhere else, doesn't matter, I'm taking it now because I really like it, climbing the waterfall. It's a beautiful image because the waterfall takes us out into the world. It pushes us into the world of things. Climbing the waterfall means phenomenologically trying to get closer to the source of intentionality, closer to the center of existence, closer to the core of consciousness. And here there's an element where phenomenology, even in Heidegger, although in a slightly different way, becomes almost, as it were, mystical or religious. Because when your primary focus is the world out there and analysis of the relations of your attention towards the world out there, that's one thing, very valuable. It's sort of like describing a periphery of consciousness. But as you gradually climb the waterfall, so to speak, back into the center of consciousness, you discover these hidden realms of human subjectivity or interiority that classically is where man meets God. So there's a religious dimension here. And I hope you and your listeners won't mind me mentioning Dugan once more, because he has a brilliant lecture series, unavailable in English, okay, only in Russian, called Phenomenological Readings of Aristotle, where he actually goes through all of this in a way that I find very helpful. And the beautiful thing, this helps us to see that you can take phenomenology in its modern versions and reread some of the older thinkers, including Aristotle, including Augustine, including a Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox Christian mystics and others, and now try to understand what they're saying from the perspective of a phenomenological model. Again, the model is a beautiful image. Just imagine a circle. Outside of the circle are the objects of the external world. We bring them onto the periphery of the circle where we treat them as objects of conscious perception. And then we go towards the center of the circle as we pay attention to what it means to have consciousness at all. And in that center of the circle, as it were, in some of these mystic or religious accounts, we meet a different intentionality, angelic or divine. And in some cases, a demonic or satanic intentionality. So you can do sort of like a phenomenology of satanic possession and stuff like that as well. One other thing I have to say very briefly is that even though you have the serious phenomenology of Husserl and Heidegger, the term phenomenology has also become popularized, and now you can have, like, you know, phenomenology of whatever, right? Phenomenology of being poor, phenomenology of a foodie, right? Like phenomenology of anything, which means I'm going to describe my lived experience, okay? Phenomenology of being an oppressed minority and so on. So that's kind of like the trivialization. But the idea there is I'm going to describe my experiences in a lot of detail. But I would say the more serious approach is the one that we've discussed.
Yeah, if you Google what is phenomenology, or put it into YouTube, like the third video you get is Black Phenomenology. Yeah, it's
right. So
right away.
So that I mean, that's important too, because the idea there is, look, we're going to describe our experience as it occurs to us. We have maybe uniquely privileged access to that experience. And you need to understand the life world of a person. You can only get it through their description of it. And I think there are like a million dissertations now that are like that. Like the phenomenology of a hungry graduate student who's working on their dissertation is the dissertation itself. So like this description of one's own experiences. So there's something to that. Obviously, it can become trivial if it doesn't actually aim to discover what, for Husserl and Heidegger, is the important thing to discover. Like, what are the underlying structures, right? What can we learn about God, man, and the world? Not just how can we justify our perspectives by describing them from a first-person point of view.
So this is probably a good time to acknowledge that Heidegger, one of the reasons I felt I just had to read him was that basically everything in one way or another seemed to be referencing back to him. Just kind of, he seemed to be someone you clearly had to tackle in one way or another before understanding a lot of what was going on in modern philosophy. Unfortunately, this means that his work is often used to create this like extreme relativism. This is where, some people will use it to justify kind of the woke mindset, these kind of things, because we're just shattering. He has broken down reality. He has deconstructed reality, and therefore reality is fake, and we can construct our own, and we can manufacture this. It's all power, and it's all whatever we want to manufacture. That is something that people can take away from this. So what do you think about the way that perhaps the left or the deconstructionists have used Heidegger? Do you feel like that's something that Heidegger would have hated, or he would have acknowledged is a consequence of his work? What would you think would be the response to that?
So first I want to say, I think this is a great topic. It is the topic of my dissertation and book, beginning with Heidegger, where I treat receptions of Heidegger across the political spectrum, intelligent, I hope, receptions of them, including Dugin's, including thinkers on the left like Rorty and Derrida, and Strauss on the right, I would say. So first thing, any great thinker will give rise to many different responses. I think that's natural. I mean, given the variety of readers and the richness of a great work, you can expect there to be many different interpretations. That's natural. Then you do have the phenomenon of the use and abuse, like Nietzsche said, the use and abuse of history for life. There's also such a thing as the use and abuse of philosophy, to provide legitimation for an ideological position. At times, I think even Dugin can be guilty of that, although, everybody, I think, is and can be. So, number one, Heidegger's work is just so rich, it can be taken in many different directions. Heidegger's influence on French leftism is a fact, a documented, hugely indisputable, massive fact. And indeed, many American academics learned Heidegger indirectly through the reception of Heidegger on the French left. So for them, Heidegger is almost like equivalent to Derrida's version or to some other version, or to even more watered down versions. So I don't think that's good. I think that if a person's impression of Heidegger is at a few steps removed from what seems like a dominant ideological source, there's a huge benefit in just going back to Heidegger and seeing what adds up. And in fact, like, my interest in this question is funny because at one and the same time as a graduate student, I was doing a class on leftist political theology, which owed a lot to Heidegger, as I was discovering through my readings. And I was translating a Dugin book on Heidegger, which owed a lot to Heidegger, obviously, in a completely different way. So I was like, how are both of these people considering themselves Heideggerians, whereas they actually probably think of themselves as mortal enemies? What's going on here, right? So what is the left leaving out, so to speak? What is the right leaving out, so to speak? And how can we triangulate and figure this all out and see, like who's just abusing it, who's making a legitimate discovery, and what accounts for these radical differences? It's I thought it was an interesting enough question to do my dissertation on it. So I would say this about the leftist deconstructive Heideggerianism, okay? Some of it is very stupid and can just be dismissed. Some of it is pretty interesting and can be treated as such. And some of it is like quite thoughtful and a high level and deserves our attention. So my personal opinion, Derrida, when he writes about Heidegger, is up there at that high level. And I just pretty much ignore the other two categories, okay? But it's true that there are a lot of people who have just weaponized their understanding of Heidegger, like they've done with Nietzsche. There's a phenomenon, I learned this from Alan Bloom's book, Closing of the American Mind. His phrase encapsulated it for me for all time: the Nietzscheanization of the left, right? Same with Carl Schmitt. There are left Schmittians. So there's always somebody who's willing to weaponize. But the question is, what did they leave out? So in the case of Heidegger, there's quite a bit that they left out, but schematically, Heidegger argues that Western philosophy has come to an end. It had a beginning, had a middle, has an end. Nietzsche's the end, and Heidegger assesses the significance of that end as well as the significance of the whole history. Leftists like that because the end of something sort of leaves them free to play. And they can always point to something in the past and say, oh, that's You thought that that was a thing, but it's not a thing. It's over. It's done. I've unpacked it. I've deconstructed it. It's dead. Dead on arrival. And moreover, I can show you how it configured power relations and so on. So they love the idea of an end because it leaves them free to play. And they use that playfulness to mask, in some sense, a will to power and whatever else they may be doing. But a huge component of Heidegger's thought is another beginning of philosophy, another disclosure of being to humanity, a new foundation, as it were, a new revelation. Okay, he's an epochal thinker and who sees himself as inaugurating a new era or epoch. They just ignore that because that's like, oh, that's too whatever, right? That's too fascist, that's too this, that's too that, that's too self-aggrandizing. So they conveniently leave that out. Dugin, by contrast, just to give an example of the different modalities here of Heidegger reception, Dugin puts the other beginning in Heidegger's thought as the centerpiece of his understanding of Heidegger, the centerpiece of his interpretation and presentation of Heidegger. In fact, Dugin's first book on Heidegger, he published several, is called Martin Heidegger, The Philosophy of Another Beginning, showing you how central this idea of another beginning is and how much it distinguishes him from, you could say that if a leftist wrote a book on Heidegger's, again, roughly, just to encapsulate the point, it would be like The End of Philosophy could be a normal title, whereas The Philosophy of Another Beginning shows you the different routes that they took here. So my view is you have to read the best representatives of serious schools of disagreement and of interpretation. So I learned from Rorty at the end of the day, even though I kind of despise his attitude towards Heidegger. I learned from Derrida, even though initially I went into the project really disliking Derrida because I thought he was just a, neo-Marxist, whatever Jordan Peterson calls him these days, right? Postmodern neo-Marxist, right? So I'm like, you may think that a philosopher, you may think that an ideologue, let's say a leftist, is always going to read philosophy in a way that's useful to his leftism. That means that his politics comes first and the philosophy is weaponized. That's what I thought I was going to find in Derrida. It's not quite what I found. So in the best case scenario, you find an intelligent thinker who takes the philosophy seriously and who thinks through the relationship of the arguments to the political positions. So because of Heidegger's greatness, because of his influence and importance, it's true that pretty much every intelligent European intellectual, at least, read him, debated him, discussed him, fought over his legacy, admired him, hated him, whatever the case is. That includes Jews, despite the fact that Heidegger was a Nazi. That includes Democrats, despite the fact that Heidegger was a Nazi. Okay. It includes everybody because that's just, you cannot get around a brilliant thinker. All that you can do is try to make sense of what it means. And that's what these people did. So to sum that all up, there's, again, a cheap appropriation, as there is of Nietzsche, which Heidegger writes about comically too at times. There's a cheap appropriation of heroism, cheap appropriation of Romanism. There are cheap appropriations of everything under the sun, of communism and of anti-communism. They're all somehow socially and politically significant, but intellectually, they just are curiosities. But the best of the best thinkers, we should understand their disagreements over Heidegger because they're significant.
Well, speaking of, I know that Leo Strauss is somebody who you highly respect and have done a lot of work on. And if I have it correct, Natural Right and History is itself a response to Heidegger, right, in a way. So this is obviously someone who he respected the thought of, but was, I don't think, on board with a lot of what Heidegger is doing. What do you think about the disagreements of those Strauss's reaction to Heidegger's work?
So this is another big and beautiful question. Strauss said some things about Heidegger that make it extremely clear how highly he held him. And he said basically for him, Heidegger was an unprecedented intellectual force. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. He made the intellectuals of the time seem like orphans. These are all things that Heidegger, like intellectual orphans, these are all things that Strauss wrote about Heidegger. Okay, he said he's the greatest thinker of our time, and so on. So Strauss clearly thought that Heidegger was a brilliant man and a true philosopher and an intellectual giant. There's a beautiful quote by Strauss. Will not get it here word for word, where he said that liberalism is in a crisis, which, by the way, we all know now and are experiencing now and are sort of living through a specific iteration of this phase of the crisis of liberalism. So he says, Liberalism is in a crisis. Only a great thinker can help us now, but the problem is that the greatest thinker of our time is Heidegger, an anti-liberal. So like liberalism needs some sort of intellectual support, but the greatest thinker of our time is actually, in some sense, the greatest critic of liberalism too. So that's a puzzle. And that puzzle is very important and somehow of the greatest significance for Strauss. Okay, that's true. It's a hidden dialogue in a certain sense because, Strauss, whereas he has books on Plato, Aristotle, Xenophon, Aristophanes, Hobbes, Machiavelli, and all these other thinkers, Heidegger is like more often than not an unstated, invisible force. He does mention him a little bit. He does write about him a little bit, but Natural Right and History doesn't say, I'm writing this against Martin Heidegger's being in time. But if you know the intellectual scene and setup and scenario, then you know that Heidegger's the target. So, the details here, even in On Tyranny, where Strauss has a debate with Kojève, they both refer to Heidegger in that debate in a very important and famous way. So here's what I would say. Heidegger was monomaniacally focused on the question of being, as I mentioned earlier. He thought it's the most important question because, think about it, you can't talk without saying, this is, that was, I am, you are. Being saturates our language and it saturates our life. It saturates our soul. Somehow it's the water in which we swim, and yet we don't pay attention to it. So Heidegger made it absolutely central. That was his focus. He said, I can't help but be a man of one book, even though he wrote so many books. His one book is the question of being, the meaning of being in truth, okay? Being. And when Strauss looked at this, he thought that Heidegger had made some important oversights. Now, we said that some philosophers are going to exclude something, but this isn't a case of one-upsmanship. This is a very important observation. So whereas Heidegger looked at the history of philosophy from Plato to Nietzsche and then another beginning with an eye to the various phases of the interpretation of being, Strauss did the same thing. He looked at the history of political philosophy from the beginning to the end in its various phases to see the transformation of the key notion. So for Heidegger, it's the history of philosophy and the key notion is being. For Strauss, it's the history of political philosophy and the key notion in Natural Right and History is nature. How did Socrates and Aristotle talk about nature? How do Hobbes, Machiavelli, Locke, and Rousseau talk about nature? How does Nietzsche talk about nature? And why has that shifted? That becomes the central category, natural right. Is there anything that is just by nature, anything that is right by nature? That led Strauss through the whole canon of the history of political philosophy. And if we see it like that, then the key question in a way becomes, why did Strauss make political philosophy the center of his project? So Heidegger made being the center of his project, and that was his philosophy means the study of being for Heidegger in some sense. Okay, it's not like you have 10 different things and being is one of them. No. Philosophy and being in some sense are equivalent for Heidegger. So you have Heidegger philosophy being and Strauss political philosophy and these different notions. And so the whole puzzle is, why did Strauss consider political philosophy to be so important? And why did he think that Heidegger's overlooking the realm of the political was not just a moral error, but a fundamentally philosophical or intellectual error? Because you could say, look, as far as being goes, Heidegger got everything right. The only problem is, because he didn't care about morality or write about morality, he sort of let other people not care about morality. You know what I mean? Like you look to him for guidance. He doesn't give you any, and therefore you have barbarism, Nazism, and genocide. If only Heidegger had cared more about morality, then we would have less guilt in celebrating his philosophy. So you can imagine a view like that, which just criticizes him for like failing to do his moral duty. But Strauss doesn't do that. Strauss doesn't, as it were, reduce his criticism of Heidegger. By the way, he doesn't have a criticism of Heidegger. He has an understanding that he thinks is limited in some sense, but it's not quite right to call it criticism. So it's not just that he says, Heidegger, you should have talked more about morality, then we could have avoided the Holocaust. The question is this: is the domain of the political and adequate reflection on the domain of political essential to philosophy? In some sense, the answer for Heidegger is no, and the answer for Strauss is yes. And therefore, we have to measure Strauss's response. Strauss seems to think, like Socrates, that the realm of the political is the realm of our opinions about good, bad, just, unjust, beautiful, ugly, right, wrong, and that we get to as it were, wisdom, or at least we get to the life that seeks wisdom only by passing through those opinions. In other words, by taking political life seriously. Plato has a work called The Laws. Plato has a work called The Statesman. Plato has a work called The Republic. Plato cared about politics, political life, and its significance for philosophy. Heidegger, he just didn't in the same way. And again, to try to state this as simply as I can, the real question is that primarily a moral failure, if it is one at all, or is it primarily a philosophical failure? And Strauss's main disagreement, so far as I can tell, again, there are details here, right? It'd take us a long time to go through them, but as far as I can tell, Strauss, unlike Heidegger, thought that political life, the notion of the political, was essential to philosophy, unlike Heidegger. And by the way, that's not arbitrary. Everybody who knows something about Plato probably knows Plato's cave allegory, probably have some rough sense, of that. Well, that's in a book called The Republic, Politeia in Greek. Plato presents, oftentimes, his philosophical ideas and insights and reflections in a very political context and in reflection on political notions. So Strauss, in that sense, is a proponent of Platonism, whereas Heidegger is an opponent of Platonism because he sees that in Plato, our interpretation of being took a wrong turn. So that's another way of understanding the difference between Strauss and Heidegger. They have a very different attitude towards Plato. And for all the significance we've given to Heidegger in this conversation, obviously infinitely important to understanding contemporary thought and the landscape of contemporary thought, oftentimes it's also an argument over Plato. Again, Strauss wants to return to Plato and Heidegger wants to overcome Plato. And that in some way is another way of putting their disagreement in a nutshell.
So obviously we've gotten to Heidegger and some of the reactions there. We don't have a giant amount of time, and I know this could be a large question. So maybe we'll do our best to kind of summarize it and come back and do some more discussion on the topic, because we could go on for quite a bit. But what about the post-Heideggerian phenomenologists? Are there people we've discussed Dugan a few times and his importance, but are there other people in the tradition that we should understand after Heidegger?
So yes, but I have to say I know less about them. Okay, so but I'll name probably the most famous one in a moment. So there's post-Heideggerian political philosophy, which I think should be isolated as a very important trend. All of these readers who read and debated with Heidegger with an intention to say something about politics, ethics, and society. And there are many thinkers there besides the ones we've mentioned. There's Emmanuel Levinas is one, for example, who said that he took Heidegger but tried to make ethics the center of his system instead of ontology. There are all these French thinkers. Again, it's the big world of people who read Heidegger in the realm of political and social philosophy, and in many other fields, incidentally. In medical fields, even in business, leadership, management, there are Heideggerians. It's pretty incredible. In artificial intelligence and computer science, there are tendencies in Heidegger study. So the Heideggerian AI, incidentally, is very interesting, I would say, field. Understanding Computers and Cognition is a book on that topic from the 70s. But sort of like strictly speaking, a philosophical phenomenology, the big name for me, and I haven't studied him, but he would be the first person I go to on this topic, is Merleau-Ponty. So Merleau-Ponty, I think it was a famous book, is called Phenomenology of Perception or something like that. And he's somebody who said, just like we had in Husserl, sort of this attention to cataloging and describing the acts of consciousness and their structures, in Heidegger, you had categorizing and schematizing human existence and its structures. So I think Merleau-Ponty said, hey, there's so much more going on in perception that we haven't quite cataloged accurately and haven't described in full detail. So Merleau-Ponty, he would be the person that I would turn to for that. And I think he's the most significant name, at least like in my model of the schools of phenomenology, independently of the specifically political reception of Heidegger.
Speaking of Heidegger in other disciplines, have you read Ian McGilchrist's work, the Master and Emissary?
So I haven't read The Master and Emissary, but I've listened to some of his interviews. I have discussed his book with people who have read it, and I have incorporated some of his insights into a separate curriculum that I made for philosophy and business, targeted to entrepreneurs. So I think it's very interesting. The only thing is I found many parallelisms between what I heard about McGilchrist and what I heard him say in his interviews and some of these other thinkers, except that he maps it all fundamentally onto the hemispheres of the brain, which is a very interesting model and probably very insightful in many different ways. Whereas for some of these, especially, German trained thinkers, that would be, they wouldn't like that because it's sort of it's too bodily of a starting point. They would see the hemispheres of the brain being a reflection of like the division of the soul or something like that. They see it not as cause, but as consequence. But yeah, he seems to be doing very interesting work. You've been reading him lately or listening to him?
Yeah, I met him in London, and I didn't know who he was, and so I got introduced to him, and he started telling me about his work, and I was like, oh, I'm reading Heidegger. Do you have anything to say about that? Like an idiot, like have you thought about this at all? It's like, yeah, a little bit. I might have put a little bit of time into it, but yeah, I'm just finishing up his book. I found it a very interesting companion, to kind of be reading that alongside being in time itself. I think, as you say, it would probably be a little too biological reductionist in some ways for people. But I think it's helpful. And ultimately, I don't think that's what he's doing. I think he's, I mean, you probably want to read the book for yourself. I think you'd find it interesting. But that could be a much longer discussion. So I won't take us down that track, but I don't think that's exactly what he's doing either. I think he's showing that many of the Heideggerian insights manifest themselves in the scientific research of how the brain is perceiving the world, but not making the argument that biology itself creates the phenomenon.
I'm sure you're right. I'm sure that's the case. I don't mean to suggest he's a reductionist. Again, I haven't read the work, so I can't comment on it in detail, but the parallelisms seem nice and interesting. And I do want to put in here a plug for the importance of reading Heidegger, even if it seems dense. I know you just went through Being in Time, start to finish, so you can attest to its density and difficulty, but it's one of those things that, having read it, you'll now have a better understanding of the many, many ways that Heidegger comes out. So even in Jordan Peterson's Rules for Life, before he gets into the first rule, he has or I think in the first rule, he has a little footnote, either for the preface or for the first chapter, where he actually credits Heidegger with his understanding of the use of being that he's going to use throughout the book. And again, people in completely other fields, maybe they don't care about politics. They don't care about Derrida or Dugin or Strauss or any of these people. They go into, psychoanalysis or, again, some medical field or some business field. And Heidegger's insights are operative there. I mean, one of the most interesting things for me, if I can say this super quickly, this was always kind of funny for me and always just unusual given the circles in which I travel, which is at one point I discovered that there was like a self-help branch of Heideggerian studies, that has no interest in political theory and Nietzsche and, and these debates, but that actually is like, they took Heidegger and they made group seminars designed to help people discover their own structures of existence. And they're actually pretty interesting and insightful. And the guy who made them, he considers himself a Heideggerian too. So all over the disciplines, Heidegger's influence is present, whether it's implicit or explicit. So reading Heidegger is like, all of that is going to be just better for people. Here you encounter it in Ian McGilchrist. Somebody else will encounter it somewhere else, in film, in philosophy. So it's read Heidegger. It's worth the effort. It's difficult, but maybe all good things are.
Yeah, it is certainly a climb. But if you put the time in, I think you will discover some very, very interesting things. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Mr. Millerman, where should people be looking for your work? Where can they get some tutoring, some classes, if they would be wanting to learn more about something like this?
So my online courses and private tutoring at millermanschool.com. My book on Heidegger, I think heideggerbook.com should take you there. I have a personal site where you can learn more about my other writings. That's probably the easiest way to get it is duganbook.com. That's my Dugan book, but it also brings you to other things I do. I'm on Twitter. I'm on YouTube, youtube.com/@Millerman, or just put Millerman into any search engine. I think you'll find all my stuff that way. But the school is millermanschool.com. I have several courses on Heidegger, in fact. And for people who don't want to buy a course, I have a lot of lectures on Heidegger on my YouTube as well, because I'm just trying to introduce people to him all the time. I think it's pretty satisfying and important. So hopefully between those two options, people find something they like.
Fantastic. All right, guys. Well, if it's your first time on this YouTube channel, please make sure to go ahead and subscribe. Click on the bell, the notification, all that stuff, so you know when we're going live. Unfortunately, today is a pre-taped, so if you had any of your questions from the audience, if you did any super chats, thank you for supporting the show, but obviously we won't be able to address them today, unfortunately. If you would like to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.